Envision a world where time travel is a reality and you possess a time machine. You set out to visit your grandfather when he was a young man, but your journey takes an unexpected turn when you unintentionally stop him from meeting your grandmother. This means that your parents were never born, and thus, you were never born either. Now, the catch is that if you were never born, how could you have taken the time machine to stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother? There's a classic problem in discussions about time travel and causality called the grandfather paradox. It challenges our understanding of cause and effect, raises questions about the consistency of time, and the possibility of altering the past. To visualize this paradox, think of it like a logical contradiction. If you never existed, there would be no way to go back in time and create this situation. The grandfather paradox is more than just a theoretical conundrum. It has profound consequences for how we conceptualize time travel. If it were feasible, it could give rise to paradoxes and complicated issues surrounding causality and the passage of time. Put simply, it would be a paradox to be able to change events in the past in a way that would prevent one's own existence. One popular explanation for the paradox is the idea of parallel universes or alternate timelines. According to this theory, if you could travel back in time and change events, you would create a new parallel timeline where the changes would have taken place. Your actions would have prevented your own existence in this new timeline, which raises intriguing questions about the nature of time and reality. Time travel can resolve the grandfather paradox in two ways. The first is by proposing that it creates branching timelines rather than changing a single fixed timeline. This way, each timeline stays consistent within its own context and avoids contradictions by separating the changes into different realities. The second is by proposing the idea of time loops or closed Timiko curves. This theory suggests that events in the past are part of a continuous process rather than a discrete event. In this theory, the grandfather paradox is resolved by the idea that the timeline is self-consistent. Your actions, even if they seem to contradict the possibility of your existence, are part of a larger, immutable loop of events that doesn't allow for contradictions. Traveling back in time creates a closed loop, meaning that any actions you take are already accounted for in the timeline. You may find that you cannot change significant events in the past because they are integrated into the timeline. In addition to being a philosophical conundrum, the grandfather paradox forces us to reevaluate our assumptions about the relationship between past events and the present, as well as the nature of time itself and the possibility of changing our perceptions of cause and effect. This paradox has far-reaching implications in fields as diverse as physics, philosophy, and even popular culture. Many theories, like Einstein's theory of relativity, do indeed allow for the theoretical possibility of time travel. However, they also imply constraints that could prevent paradoxes like the grandfather paradox from occurring. For instance, some physicists contend that specific conditions, like the need for infinite energy or closed Tim-like curves, could theoretically prevent paradoxical scenarios from occurring. The paradox forces us to grapple with the implications of changing past events and the potential consequences for our perception of reality. In popular culture, the grandfather paradox has inspired various works of fiction, from novels to movies, that delve into the intricacies and outcomes of time. If time travel were feasible, it could raise questions about whether our actions are predetermined or if we have the freedom to alter the course of events. Time travel is still a theoretical concept, but fictional depictions of it often explore the paradox in interesting ways, shedding light on the problems and possible solutions that could come from trying to travel through time. Moving forward, the grandfather paradox is still a good thought experiment for examining how far we can push the boundaries of our perception of time and reality. The thought experiment at the heart of Schrödinger's cat, one of the most famous paradoxes in physics, challenges our understanding of reality by prompting us to reconsider our notions of time causality and the nature of reality. By examining the paradox and its implications, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities associated with time travel and the broader philosophical questions it raises. The strange laws of the quantum realm, and, don't worry, no cats were hurt in the making of this paradox. It's not about real feline cruelty, but rather about discovering the secrets of life. The story begins in 1935, when Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger came up with the experiment to demonstrate what he perceived as the strange and unsettling consequences of quantum mechanics. To illustrate, consider the Schinger cat experiment. It involves a sealed box, a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison. If the atom decays, the poison is released and the cat dies. However, if the atom does not decay, the poison is never released and the cat stays alive. Now, what makes this experiment interesting from a quantum mechanical perspective is that the atom exists in a strange and counterintuitive state of superposition. It has both decayed and not decayed simultaneously. Since the atom state determines the cat's fate, the cat is also in a superpositional state, both alive and dead. This seems ridiculous, doesn't it? Schrödinger's thought experiment was not intended to explain quantum mechanics, but to criticize it. At the core of the paradox lies the idea that in the quantum world, particles don't exist in distinct states until they are observed. For example, before you open the box to check on the cat, it exists in both the alive and dead states simultaneously. However, the act of observation forces the cat into one state or the other, causing the superposition to collapse. This idea is known as the Copenhagen interpretation, and it suggests that reality at the quantum level isn't fixed until it's noticed, or in other words, when something is observed. However, Schrödinger's cat makes us question how strange this idea is. If something can exist in two states at once, is it necessary for there to be a conscious human observer, or could the Geiger counter be considered an observation? Another philosophical question that the paradox raises is what it means for something to exist in two realities at once. Superposition makes sense at the level of atoms and particles, and experiments have proven that it's real. However, at the level of cats, reality becomes more complicated. In everyday life, things can only be one way, like a light being on or off, or a door being open or closed. However, in the quantum world, things can exist in a state of both, rather than just one. This forces us to think in entirely new ways. Schrödinger's cat also brings attention to the problem of scale in quantum mechanics. At the heart of the cat-in-the-box paradox is the question of how the bizarre rules of quantum mechanics give birth to the more familiar rules of classical physics. What's interesting is that there are alternative interpretations of quantum mechanics that provide different explanations. For instance, the many-worlds interpretation proposes that the universe splits in two. In one theory, the cat is alive in one universe and dead in the other. This is known as superposition. Another theory, quantum decoherence, posits that superposition is broken by interactions with the environment. In this theory, the cat isn't really alive and dead at the same time. Rather, our limited ability to measure quantum interactions gives the illusion of multiple realities. Superposition. These explanations reveal that Schrödinger's cat is more than a paradox. It's a portal into the most fundamental questions regarding space-time, reality, and the nature of reality itself. The paradox also has real-world applications. Quantum mechanics isn't merely theoretical. It forms the basis of numerous technological advancements, such as semiconductors and quantum computers. The comprehension of these principles is not merely a philosophical exercise. It forms the bedrock of technological advancement. Ultimately, Schrödinger's cat is not merely a whimsical thought experiment. Rather, it is an in-depth investigation into the enigmas of reality. It compels us to go beyond our mundane experiences and face the peculiar, paradoxical laws of the quantum realm. Possibly the most significant takeaway from this work is the possibility that, on a fundamental level, reality is far stranger and more complicated than we have ever imagined. When you consider the Schrödinger cat, keep in mind that it's more than just a paradox. It's a symbol of the undiscovered mysteries of the cosmos. The universe is enormous. There are hundreds of billions of galaxies, each containing billions of stars, and many of those stars have planets orbiting them. Given this vastness, it appears nearly certain that intelligent life, must exist elsewhere in the cosmos. However, despite decades of searching, we have discovered no signs of extraterrestrial life. Physicist Enrio Fermi gave a universe its name when he casually asked, "Where is everyone?" during a lunch conversation in 1950. The math appears to demand that intelligent life should be out there with so many stars and planets. Even if life arises on a tiny fraction of them, there should still be millions, if not billions, of them. Instead, there are spacecraft and no signs of advanced civilizations, which is a puzzling contradiction. Our galaxy is home to countless civilizations, and if even a fraction of them are capable of traveling between stars, we should be seeing signs of their presence everywhere. So far, though, we haven't seen a single intelligent civilization. One possible explanation is that although water, carbon, and energy are abundant, the transition from simple molecules to complex organisms and finally to intelligent beings is so implausible that it has only occurred on Earth. This is all just a cosmic fluke, the product of an extremely unlikely chain of events. On the other hand, it's possible that extraterrestrial civilizations do in fact exist, but their signals haven't made it to Earth yet, or our technology hasn't caught up to their signals. The sheer size of the universe is mind-boggling, so even traveling at the speed of light would take more than 100,000 years to traverse our galaxy. We haven't seen any extraterrestrial civilizations nearby, which raises the unsettling possibility that they don't want to be discovered either, because they are afraid of drawing hostile attention or because they believe in non-interference, also known as the zoo hypothesis, which holds that Earth is like an exhibit in a cosmic zoo, observed but left undisturbed. Another unsettling possibility is that one possible explanation is that our perception is limited. For example, what if alien life exists but is so dissimilar from ourselves that we fail to detect it? Another is that civilizations self-destruct before they can establish meaningful contact. Advanced technology brings tremendous power but also enormous risks, such as nuclear weapons, environmental collapse, and artificial intelligence. The Fermi paradox challenges us to face the enormity of the universe and the fallibility of our assumptions. We often picture aliens as either radio-communicating civilizations or humanoid beings, but the truth is that life on other planets could be completely different from what we've ever imagined. Extraterrestrials could exist in forms we can't detect or in dimensions we can't perceive. They could even be here, but we're just too busy to notice them. The story goes on, but the universe isn't obligated to live up to our expectations. Whether intelligent life is rare, far away, hidden, or extinct, every possible explanation challenges our perception of ourselves and our role in the universe. Some thinkers propose a more practical solution to the paradox, arguing that maybe we haven't been searching for long enough or in the right ways. After all, our technology has only enabled us to scan for extraterrestrial signals for a few decades, which is a dime in cosmic time. Some people think that the universe is trying to tell us something about life, intelligence, or the laws of physics because it seems to be silent and empty. Others think that the conditions needed to support life are rare or ephemeral, like a spark in an electrical current. Some believe that it may take centuries of effort before we see results, and that the Fermi paradox is just a reminder to be patient. In an otherwise uninteresting cosmos, the Fermi paradox poses the question, where are the aliens? And, more importantly, what does their absence mean for us if we are truly alone? This poses a tremendous challenge to humanity, as it implies that we are solely responsible for ensuring the continuation of intelligent life in the universe. It also encourages us to be more conscientious of our planet, to safeguard the delicate conditions that allow life to flourish, and to reflect deeply on how we may one day present ourselves to the universe. In the end, the Fermi paradox persists. The paradox of receiving a book full of revolutionary ideas only to find out that you wrote it, except you haven't written it yet. Now imagine traveling back in time and giving birth to a new version of the book. The answers to these and other profound questions about existence, from the beginnings of life to the destiny of civilizations, may remain elusive, but the quest itself has the power to bring us together as a species and as individuals capable of curiosity, imagination, and hope. The bootstrap paradox is a perplexing concept in time travel where an object or piece of information exists without a clear point of origin. It loops endlessly through time, challenging our understanding of cause and effect. The idea behind the paradox is based on the phrase, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, which describes the process by which one's younger self writes a book in the future. Here's a classic example to help illustrate the paradox. What appears to be an impossible object creates itself when sent back in time, but how it came to be is still a mystery. To make it easier to understand, let's say a scientist from the future builds a time machine. Then they visit their younger self and give them the blueprints for how to build the machine. Their younger self then uses these blueprints to construct the time machine. He receives the blueprints for the time machine as a child and grows up to be the same scientist who uses it. But there's a catch. The original idea for the machine wasn't invented. It was just passed around in an endless loop. So, although the machine exists, it has no real beginning. This paradox challenges one of our most basic assumptions about reality, that every effect must have a cause. In the bootstrap paradox, the cause and effect are so entangled that they become indistinguishable. We live in a world where time flows in a linear fashion, from the past to the present to the future. However, in a time travel scenario, these rules become twisted. Not only can the past impact the future, but the future can also impact the past, leading to a paradox that is both intriguing and potentially life-threatening. This is known as the bootstrap paradox. The philosophical mystery of the bootstrap paradox forces us to face the idea that time isn't as simple as it appears. Instead, it could be considerably more malleable and subject to random chance. If the plans for the time machine don't have an origin, does that mean the scientist's actions are predetermined by the loop? On the other hand, could the paradox itself be a demonstration of how free what can exist outside of linear causality? In science fiction, the bootstrap paradox is frequently explored in innovative ways. For instance, in the film Terminator, a character goes back in time to save a future leader, but in doing so, they become entangled in the events that lead to that leader's rise. Another example is the timeless time travel novel The Time Traveler's Wife, which explores the concept of a self-contained loop where events occur because they have already occurred. These stories emphasize the peculiar and fascinating nature of the paradox, inviting us to envision a world where time is anything but linear. The bootstrap paradox is scientifically related to theories of time travel, especially in general relativity. Einstein's equations allow for the possibility of closed, Tim-like curves, which are like loops in space-time, where events can circle back on themselves. While this idea is still theoretical, it suggests that the paradox might not be purely imaginary, but actually a feature of the universe. But here's where it gets interesting. Becomes even more intriguing, the bootstrap paradox isn't just about time travel, it's also about information and causality. Picture this. A scientific formula or a historical event exists only because it was sent back in time. Who created it? Does it really exist? This idea challenges our understanding of knowledge and creation, blurring the lines between what is real and what is just a product of the loop. The bootstrap paradox also has profound implications for: does the bootstrap paradox have any solutions outside of the linear time framework? If time can indeed loop back on itself, it suggests that the universe could be an unending system without a beginning or end. In this view, the Big Bang could not be the beginning of everything, but rather a part of a larger cyclical process. The paradox makes us wonder if there is a true beginning or if everything is just a part of a web of cause and effect. The paradox of time and causality as we know it exists because it refuses to be solved, which forces us to question our assumptions about logic and time. Rather than a problem, it's a question that needs to be explored, leading us to a deeper understanding of these mysteries. The universe is stranger and more complex than we often realize, and the bootstrap paradox reminds us of that. It invites us to imagine realities where beginnings and endings blur, and cause and effect aren't clearly defined. In a world where logic and rules abound, there will always be mysteries that leave us wondering. Paradoxes force us to question, explore, and dream. If you replaced every part of a ship, its planks, sails, and wheels, until none of the original parts remained, would it still be the same ship? This question, known as the Ship of Theseus, is one of the most enduring and consequential lessons from the paradox, baffling paradoxes of all time. It doesn't merely test our understanding of objects. It compels us to ponder the concept of identity itself. Is it the substance, its construction, or something more abstract that determines an object's identity? Consider a ship lying in a harbor. As time passes, its parts deteriorate and wear out. The crew gradually replaces each part, starting with a few planks, then a mast, and finally every single plank. Despite this, the ship continues to sail, carrying its crew and... Does it appear to be the same ship, but is it really? If it isn't, when did it cease to be the Ship of Theseus? After one plank was replaced, 10, or all of them? To further complicate matters, what would constitute the actual Ship of Theseus? The one that has been rebuilt from its original parts, or the one that has been continuously maintained and updated? Or are they, in some strange way, identical? This paradox fails to provide an answer. The Ship of Theseus is more than just a ship-themed thought experiment. It's a metaphor for how everything in life changes with time. Consider your own body. Every cell dies and regenerates at some point. After a few decades of life, you've likely had most of your original cells replaced. Are you still essentially the same person after all this time? If so, what makes you unique? Your memories, your personality, or something more intangible? The paradox. It makes us think about the objects around us and how they change over time. For example, if you take an old car and fix every part of it, is it still the same car? The Ship of Theseus shows us that our concept of identity is more fluid than we think. It shows that things we consider permanent are actually constantly changing. Philosophers have debated this for centuries, with some saying that identity is tied to function or purpose. According to some, the Ship of Theseus doesn't change much no matter what it's made of. What matters is that it sails and does its job. On the other hand, some argue that identity is intrinsically linked to the material, and that the rebuilt ship from the original parts is the real deal. A third viewpoint questions the idea that identity is static and proposes that Theseus isn't just a ship. The paradox has deep implications for our understanding of personal growth and change. As individuals, we are constantly evolving, shaped by our beliefs, values, and experiences. Sometimes, we don't fully recognize how these factors impact us. The Ship of Theseus challenges us to consider the artificiality of the boundaries we draw around ourselves, whether it's for objects on board or for ourselves. Look back at who you were 5, 10, or 20 years ago. You might feel like you're a completely different person, but are you like the Ship of Theseus, a continuation of the same essence carried forward through time and transformation? This paradox even extends to how we think about societies, cultures, and traditions. A city may replace its buildings, roads, and infrastructure over centuries, but it still feels like the same place. Languages evolve, losing old words and gaining new ones, yet they remain. Recognizable traditions are preserved through adaptation and passing down. They maintain a continuity of spirit. The Ship of Theseus serves as a reminder that being an individual isn't about clinging to the past, but rather about adapting to new circumstances while staying connected to our roots. So, how can we resolve this great paradox? Well, we don't like definitive answers, but this one forces us to think about our identity in more complex ways. It demonstrates that change doesn't destroy what was, but rather builds upon it. Whether it's a ship, a car, a city, or a person, identity isn't something static or absolute. Rather, it's a process, a journey, and a story that we tell ourselves. The Ship of Theseus teaches us that, despite changes, something essential remains. What exactly that something is might vary depending on our perspective on the world. Additionally, the paradox reminds us that identity isn't a simple equation, but rather a dance between the old and the new, the past and the future, the parts and the whole. Maybe the reason it's so transformative is because Catch-22 is a paradox that traps you in a no-win situation where every option seems to cancel itself out. It's a problem of logic, bureaucracy, and human frustration all rolled into one. The 1961 book by Joseph Tell deals with a military regulation that states a soldier must prove they are insane in order to be excused from dangerous missions. However, the rule has a twist. If the soldier applies for an exemption, they're demonstrating concern for their own safety, which is a perfectly reasonable action, thus they are not insane. On the other hand, not applying implies that they are willingly putting themselves in harm's way, which could suggest sanity but also keeps them stuck in missions. Of the Catch-22 is how it captures the absurdity of bureaucratic logic. It's a rule that creates a closed loop, trapping anyone who tries to engage with it. And while it originated in Hell's novel, the concept of a Catch-22 is something most of us have experienced in real life. Think about job hunting. Many entry-level positions require years of experience. But how do you get expert experience if all the jobs that? The frustrating part is that no matter what you do, you'll end up right back where you started. It's not just bad luck or tough choices. The system is to blame for creating the impossibility. You're stuck in a vicious cycle, ensnared by the logic of the rules, and unable to break free without contradicting them. About individual frustration, it's also a reflection of larger societal and institutional problems. It reveals how rules and systems, which are supposed to help us, can sometimes become self-defeating. Bureaucracies in particular are notorious for creating Catch-22s. Think of a government agency requiring paperwork that's impossible to obtain without their approval, or a university insisting on prerequisites for a course that can only be fulfilled by taking the course itself. The paradox also raises deeper questions about power. Logic is supposed to help us make sense of the world, but logic can also create traps when applied without consideration for real-world situations. In a Catch-22, the system holds all the cards, and the individual is forced to play by rules that are inherently unfair, often with no one to appeal to. It's a stark reminder of how systems can use logic to maintain authority and keep people trapped. The Catch-22 is a cautionary tale about the world's repercussions when regulations trump common sense and human needs. The term has become a cultural touchstone for describing a wide range of absurd situations, from legal disputes to bureaucratic red tape. Loopholes abound. But how do we solve a Catch-22? Well, first, we need to see the paradox for what it is, a self-defeating system. If we can do that, we can begin to navigate it more effectively. If that fails, we can try to find other ways around it, such as by challenging the rules or finding someone else who does. Catch-22s also serve as reminders of the significance of questioning the systems in which we live. Does the existence of these paradoxes reflect poorly designed systems, or do they actually serve a purpose? In many instances, Catch-22s persist because they uphold the status quo, making it harder for individuals to question authority or break free from the rules. By recognizing and highlighting these paradoxes, we can advocate for changes that make systems more equitable and compassionate. In the end, the Catch-22 is more than just a frustrating puzzle. It embodies the tension between individual agency and the needs of society. Intersections of logic and absurdity teach us to question the rules we follow and the systems we navigate. The next time you're stuck in a Catch-22, know that you're not alone. Paradoxes like these have perplexed and frustrated people for decades, and they probably will continue to do so. However, by delving into their complexities, we can uncover the hidden dynamics at work and perhaps uncover a way to flip the system on its head. You walk into an ice cream shop, ready to indulge in a sweet craving. Instead of the usual 5 or 6 flavors, you're faced with 50 options. At first, you're thrilled, but as you try to decide, you start to feel overwhelmed. What if Rocky Road was perfect? Or what if the salted caramel wasn't available, and you choose pistachio instead? Suddenly, what should have been a simple and joyful decision turns into a struggle. The paradox of choice describes how, despite the apparent benefits of having more options, we can actually end up less happy anxious, and satisfied with our decisions. This idea challenges one of modern society's biggest assumptions, that freedom of choice is always a good thing. Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized the concept of the paradox of choice by arguing that when faced with an overwhelming number of choices, we tend to freeze up. Consider this. How often have you spent hours perusing movie streaming platforms before settling on a familiar one? The more options we have, the more difficult it is to decide, as each choice brings the fear of missing out on something better. But the paradox doesn't end there. It also affects how satisfied we feel after making a decision. For example, imagine returning to the ice cream shop and finally settling on salted caramel. As you eat, even though the salted caramel is really tasty, you can't help but feel guilty about not getting more pistachios. This is called post-decision regret, and it's a major way that the paradox of choice makes us unhappy. The reason behind this is opportunity cost, which states that whenever we make a choice, we're essentially passing up another opportunity to do something else. The opportunity cost may not seem significant when there are few options, but when there are many, the alternatives we passed up become all too real, making it difficult to fully appreciate the one we did choose. Another factor is our own expectations. When faced with a limited number of choices, we may be content with what we get, but when faced with 50, we may expect the perfect flavor, one that will astound you, and if salted caramel falls short of that unattainable standard of perfection, you'll be let down, not because it was bad, but because it wasn't ideal. The paradox of choice demonstrates that while having more options increases our freedom, it also increases our potential for disappointment. Interestingly, not everyone is affected by this paradox to the same extent. Some people, called maximizers, feel driven to always choose the best option, regardless of the circumstances. People who maximize their choices tend to be overly concerned with whether they made the right choice. For example, they might read hundreds of reviews before purchasing a phone or spend hours researching restaurants before deciding where to eat. On the other hand, satisficers aim for good enough, make quick decisions without worrying about what they might have missed, and are generally happier and more relaxed as a result. This dichotomy is known as the paradox of choice. Has profound implications for how we live our lives in today's twos world. We're bombarded with options: what to eat, what to wear, what to watch, where to live, who to date, what career to pursue. On the surface, this abundance of choice seems empowering, but in reality, it can lead to decision fatigue, a state where the sheer effort of choosing leaves us drained and less capable of making good decisions. So, how do we navigate the paradox of choice? One solution is to embrace the idea of good enough instead of obsessing over. The paradox of choice teaches us that true happiness doesn't come from having unlimited options, but rather from finding the perfect option, appreciating the choices we make, and letting go of the ones we didn't. Another strategy is to limit the number of options we consider. For example, instead of endlessly scrolling through a streaming platform, we could pick from the first 5 movies we see. By simplifying our decision-making process, we reduce stress and increase satisfaction. This paradox of choice isn't merely about ice cream flavors or streaming platforms. It's a reflection of how we navigate the complexity of modern life. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about freedom and happiness, and to recognize that sometimes less is more. By understanding this paradox, we can make better decisions, because freedom isn't about endless possibilities, but about having the clarity and confidence to choose without regret. Discover a world where our efforts to make things more secure actually make them more dangerous. It's a fascinating and unsettling idea, but it's the core of the stability-instability paradox, a concept with its roots in international relations and political science. This paradox explains how our pursuit of peace and stability can paradoxically increase the likelihood of conflict. A concept of mutually assured destruction created what seemed like an ironic form of peace during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were nuclear superpowers with enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other and the world multiple times over. However, this idea also posed challenges to our understanding of security and the delicate balance of power. The instability paradox emerged during this tense era. The threat of nuclear war stabilized global relations, but paradoxically made smaller localized conflicts more likely. This is because when two major powers know that full-scale war is not an option, they may feel emboldened to engage in smaller indirect confrontations. This happened during the Cold War in Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan, where the superpowers supported opposing sides without directly confronting each other. At its core, the stability-instability paradox is about incentives. When stability is maintained at the highest level through a balance of power, fear of escalation, or stability, it creates a sense of security that lowers the perceived risks of smaller-scale conflicts. Actors may feel they can engage in limited aggression without triggering a catastrophic response. This shows how efforts to maintain stability paradoxically make smaller wars more likely. The paradox of nuclear-armed states, where peace can inadvertently lead to violence, is not limited to the Cold War. It has far-reaching implications for contemporary geopolitics, especially in light of the fact that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction serves as a deterrent against full-scale war. This dynamic is also at work in regional conflicts, such as when tensions between nuclear-armed neighbors like Pakistan and India flare up into border disputes and skirmishes, despite the threat of nuclear weapons. In the realm of cybersecurity, for instance, as nations and organizations fortify their digital defenses, they unwittingly heighten the arms race between hackers and cybercriminals. As defenses get stronger, the attacks get more sophisticated, perpetuating the cycle of stability at the systemic level and instability at the tactical level. This instability-stability paradox is not limited to warfare, but can be applied to a wide range of fields. Similarly, in economics, attempts to regulate markets can sometimes lead to localized bubbles or crises as players take advantage of what they see as safety nets. This paradox prompts thought-provoking questions about power and security, including, how can we strike a balance between the two? Can we design a system that is both stable and flexible without fostering the instability that the paradox describes? Problems like these have no simple solutions, but they do show how important it is to consider the repercussions of our choices carefully. The stability-instability paradox teaches us that systems like economic markets, geopolitical alliances, and technological networks are intricate and interdependent, and that it can be difficult to foresee how our actions will affect these systems. The instability paradox shows us the dangers of thinking that stability is self-sustaining. It challenges us to think beyond short-term goals and consider the broader dynamics at play, and it emphasizes the need of communication and trust in international relations. When actors understand each other's intentions and capabilities, they are less likely to stumble into conflicts that could spiral out of control. Demands ongoing dedication, teamwork, and watchfulness. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the paradox is its persistence as long as there are imbalances of power or competing interests. The dynamics it describes will continue to shape our world. The paradox forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that peace is fragile and often paradoxical in nature. It's not simply the absence of conflict, it's a delicate equilibrium that can tip into instability when pushed too far. So, what can we learn from the stability? Instability paradox. First, it teaches us to question the assumption that stability is always a good thing. While stability can reduce the likelihood of large-scale conflict, it can also create conditions for smaller-scale aggression. Second, it challenges us to think critically about the unintended consequences of our actions, particularly in complex systems. And finally, it reminds us that true security requires more than deterrence. It requires understanding, adaptability, and a willingness to engage with uncertainty. In the end, the stability-instability paradox isn't just a concept from international relations. It's a lens for understanding the complexities of human behavior, systems, and relationships. It challenges us to navigate the fine line between peace and conflict, stability and chaos, and to recognize that the answers to these challenges are rarely simple, and perhaps that's the paradox's greatest lesson, that the pursuit of stability is itself a dynamic, ever-evolving process, one that requires constant reflection, humility, and care. Simpson's paradox: imagine two treatment options for a life-threatening disease. You're told treatment has a higher success rate than treatment B, so you confidently choose treatment A. But later you learn that when you break the data into subgroups, say younger and older patients, treatment B actually performs better in both groups. How can treatment B be better in every subgroup, but treatment A still has a higher overall success rate? This is Simpson's paradox, a statistical phenomenon that defies intuition and reveals the surprising ways data can mislead us. At its core, Simpson's paradox occurs when trends that appear in different groups of data disappear, or even reverse when the groups are combined. It's a paradox that challenges our understanding of statistics and forces us to rethink how we interpret information. To make this clearer, let's dive into an example. Imagine a university that is evaluating its admission rates for male and female applicants. The data shows that overall a higher percentage of male applicants were admitted compared to female applicants, suggesting potential gender bias. But when you break the data down by departments, you discover that each department actually admitted a higher percentage of female applicants than male applicants. How is this possible? The answer lies in the composition of the data. In this scenario, the paradox occurs because women apply disproportionately to highly competitive departments with low admission rates, while men applied more often to less competitive departments with higher admission rates. When the data is aggregated, these differences skew the overall results, creating the illusion of bias against women, even though no such bias exists within individual departments. This paradox is a reminder of the dangers of oversimplifying data. It highlights the importance of context and shows how combining or aggregating data can mask important details. In the example of the university admissions, the overall numbers told one story, but the departmental breakdown told a very different one. Simpson's paradox teaches us that the way we group and analyze data can fundamentally change the conclusions we draw. The implications of Simpson's paradox go far beyond hypothetical examples. It appears in real-world scenarios across a wide range of fields, from medicine and social science to sports and public policy. For instance, in clinical trials, a treatment might seem effective when the results are aggregated, but turn out to be less effective or even harmful when analyzed. For specific subgroups, such as age or gender in politics, aggregated voting data can suggest trends that don't hold true within individual demographics. Even in business marketing campaigns or product evaluations can be misleading if the data isn't analyzed carefully. The paradox also raises deeper questions about causality and decision-making. When faced with contradictory patterns in data, how do we determine which perspective is correct? Should we focus on the overall trend, or should we prioritize the subgroup analysis? The answer often depends on the context and the questions we're trying to answer. Simpson's paradox reminds us that data doesn't speak for itself. It requires interpretation, and that interpretation can be influenced by how the data is presented and understood. One of the most important lessons of Simpson's paradox is the need for critical thinking and careful analysis. In a world increasingly driven by data, it's easy to take numbers at face value, especially when they confirm our assumptions or fit a compelling narrative. But Simpson's paradox shows that data can be more complex than it appears, and that even seemingly straightforward statistics can be deceptive. This paradox also has profound implications for how we communicate data. Misleading interpretations of data can have serious consequences, from flawed medical decisions to misguided policies. Understanding Simpson's paradox can help us become more discerning consumers of information, better equipped to ask the right questions and challenge misleading conclusions. Simpson's paradox also reminds us of the importance of transparency in data analysis. When presenting data, it's essential to provide enough context and detail to allow others to understand how the data was collected, grouped, and analyzed. Aggregated results can be useful, but they should always be accompanied by a breakdown of subgroups to avoid oversimplification and misinterpretation. Philosophically, Simpson's paradox challenges us to think about the nature of truth and perception. It reveals how different perspectives on the same data can lead to conflicting conclusions, forcing us to grapple with the idea that truth is often more nuanced than we'd like to believe. It's paradox that invites us to embrace complexity and to question our assumptions about the way the world works. In the end, Simpson's paradox isn't just a quirk of statistics. It's a powerful reminder of the importance of context, critical thinking, and curiosity. It teaches us to look beyond the surface, to dig deeper into the data, and to approach information with a healthy dose of skepticism. And in a world where data increasingly shapes our decisions, that lesson might just be one of the most life-changing. Paradoxes of all unexpected hanging. Paradox: a prisoner is sentenced to be hanged, but with an unusual twist, the judge announces you will be hanged at noon on one weekday next week. But it will be a surprise. You won't know the day of your execution until the executioner arrives. The prisoner, desperate to avoid the news, thinks carefully and begins to analyze the situation. If the execution happens on Friday, he reasons it won't be a surprise, because if he's still alive by Thursday evening, Friday is the only day left, so Friday is ruled out. Then if Friday is ruled out, Thursday can't be the day either. After all, if he's alive by Wednesday night, Thursday would also be predictable. Using this same logic, the prisoner eliminates Wednesday, Tuesday, and even Monday. He concludes that the judge's statement is impossible and he'll never be hanged. Feeling relieved, the prisoner goes to bed confident in his reasoning. But on Wednesday at noon, the executioner arrives, and the prisoner is hanged completely by surprise. How is this possible? This is the unexpected hanging paradox, a thought experiment that has baffled philosophers, mathematicians, and logicians for decades. It's a paradox that plays with our understanding of logic, knowledge, and self-fulfilling reasoning. At first glance, the prisoner's reasoning seems airtight. By eliminating each day as a possibility, he concludes that the judge's statement contradicts itself. But this paradox reveals a deeper flaw in how we think about knowledge and surprise. The key lies in the prisoner's assumption that he can predict the execution by ruling out days. While his logic is internally consistent, it fails to account for the very nature of surprise. Let's break it down. The judge's promise has two parts. First, the prisoner will be hanged next week. Second, the hanging will come as a surprise. The prisoner's mistake is in treating these two conditions as if they're entirely separate. By trying to outsmart the judge, the prisoner convinces himself that the hanging can't happen at all. But this very conclusion ensures that when the execution does occur on a day he ruled out, it will indeed be a surprise, fulfilling the judge's promise. The unexpected hanging paradox challenges our understanding of logical reason and prediction. It highlights the limits of deductive reasoning, especially when applied to situations involving surprise or uncertainty. The prisoner's logic works only if he assumes that his deductions can't be wrong, but the paradox exposes how his own reasoning creates the conditions for the judge's statement to hold true. This paradox has fascinated logicians because it raises profound questions about the nature of self-referential statements and the relationship between knowledge and uncertainty. It's similar to other paradoxes like the liar paradox, where a statement like "this sentence is false" creates a loop of contradiction. In the unexpected hanging paradox, the prisoner's reasoning becomes self-referential. He uses his predictions to try to avoid the surprise, but those very predictions ensure the surprise happen. Philosophers have debated the deeper implications of this paradox for decades. One interpretation is that it reveals the limits of human reasoning. Our logical systems rely on clear rules and assumptions, but the unexpected hanging paradox shows that even the most rigorous reasoning can break down when it encounters uncertainty or self-reference. It forces us to confront the possibility that some aspects of reality might be fundamentally unpredictable. The paradox also has connections to game theory and decision-making. In game theory, players often try to anticipate their opponents' moves, but the unexpected hanging paradox shows how overthinking and second-guessing can backfire. By trying to predict the execution, the prisoner inadvertently ensures its success. This has parallels in real life, where attempts to outsmart systems or predict outcomes can lead to unintended consequences. But the paradox isn't just a puzzle for philosophers. It has practical implications for how we think about surprise, uncertainty, and planning. It reminds us that not everything can be predicted or controlled, no matter how Much we analyze or prepare in a world filled with uncertainty, the unexpected hanging paradox teaches us to embrace the unexpected and recognize the limits of our knowledge. What's particularly striking about this paradox is its ability to create tension between logic and intuition. On the surface, the prisoner's reasoning feels flawless, yet the moment the execution happens, we realize the flaw in his thinking. This tension between expectation and reality is what makes the paradox so compelling and so deeply unsettling. The unexpected hanging paradox forces us to confront one of life's greatest mysteries, the nature of the unknown. It challenges us to think critically about how we approach uncertainty and reminds us that even the most carefully constructed plans can be upended by the unexpected. And perhaps that's the paradox's greatest lesson, that sometimes the only certainty is surprise itself. Tolerance paradox. Can a tolerant society remain tolerant if it tolerates intolerance? This is the tolerance paradox, a profound and troubling dilemma. First introduced by philosopher Karl Popper, it challenges the very foundation of what it means to live in an open, free society. At its core is a simple yet uncomfortable question: how far should we go in accepting opposing viewpoints, especially when those viewpoints threaten the very fabric of tolerance itself? Let's imagine a society built on the principle of tolerance. People are free to express their beliefs, live how they want, and engage in open dialogue. But then an intolerant ideology begins to emerge, one that rejects the values of tolerance and actively works to suppress others' freedoms. What should the tolerant society do? If it tolerates the intolerant, it risks being overrun by those who reject tolerance altogether. But if it doesn't tolerate the intolerant, hasn't it abandoned its own principle of tolerance? This is the heart of the paradox. Tolerance is often seen as an absolute good, but the tolerance paradox reveals its limits. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that tolerance, when taken to an extreme, can become self-destructive. Poe introduced this idea in his 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. He argued that unlimited tolerance leads to the erosion of tolerance itself. If a society allows intolerant ideologies to take root and spread unchecked, those ideologies can eventually undermine the freedoms that made the society tolerant in the first place. Popper's solution was clear but controversial. A tolerant society must reserve the right to be intolerant toward intolerance. On the surface, this might sound contradictory. After all, how can a society commit to tolerance justify being intolerant? But Popper's argument isn't about suppressing disagreement or silencing opposing viewpoints. It's about drawing a line when those viewpoints actively threaten the rights and safety of others. The goal isn't to eliminate conflict or disagreement, but to protect the very conditions that make a tolerant society possible. The tolerance paradox isn't just a philosophical puzzle. It has real-world implications. Consider freedom of speech, one of the cornerstones of a tolerant society. Should this freedom extend to those who use it to spread hate speech, incite violence, or advocate for the suppression of others' freedoms? Some argue that even the most offensive ideas should be allowed in the name of free expression, trusting that open debate will expose and discredit harmful views. Others contend that allowing such speech can create an environment where intolerance thrives, ultimately putting vulnerable groups at risk. History offers plenty of examples where the tolerance paradox is played out in dramatic ways. In the early 20th century, many democratic nations tolerated the rise of authoritarian movements, believing they could coexist with democratic values. But in cases like Nazi Germany, that tolerance allowed intolerant ideologies to gain power and dismantle democracy from within. These historical lessons show that unchecked tolerance can have devastating consequences. But where should we draw the line? This is where the tolerance paradox becomes especially tricky. Not all forms of intolerance are equally dangerous, and not all disagreements threaten the fabric of society. Disagreeing with someone's political views or cultural practices isn't the same as advocating for their suppression. The challenge lies in distinguishing between harmful intolerance that needs to be addressed and healthy conflict that should be encouraged. Critics of Popper's idea often raise concerns about who gets to decide what counts as intolerant. They argue that labeling certain ideas or groups as Intolerant can be subjective, and prone to abuse a government or group in power could misuse this principle to silence dissent under the guise of protecting tolerance. This highlights the delicate balance a society must strike between protecting itself and avoiding authoritarianism. The tolerance paradox also raises important questions about human psychology and group dynamics, and intolerance often arises from fear, ignorance, or a sense of threat. Addressing these underlying causes through education, dialogue, and empathy can be more effective than simply suppressing intolerant ideas. But even these approaches have limits, especially when dealing with ideologies that are fundamentally opposed to dialogue or compromise. In today's polarized world, the tolerance paradox feels more relevant than ever. We see debates over free speech, censorship, and the boundaries of tolerance play out daily, from social media platforms to political arenas. As we navigate these challenges, the paradox reminds us that tolerance isn't just about accepting differences, it's about actively protecting the principles that make coexistence possible. So what can we learn from the tolerance paradox? First, it teaches us that tolerance has limits, and those limits are necessary to preserve the values we hold dear. Second, it challenges us to think critically about how we respond to intolerance, whether through open dialogue, legal protections, or in extreme cases, restrictions. And finally, it reminds us that a tolerant society is not a passive one. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront difficult questions about freedom, fairness, and justice. The tolerance paradox isn't just a problem to be solved, it's a reflection of the complexities of living in a diverse and open society. It forces us to grapple with the tension between our ideals and the realities of human behavior. And perhaps its greatest lesson is that tolerance isn't a static principle, it's a dynamic process, one that requires constant effort to uphold. In the end, the paradox doesn't weaken the idea of tolerance, it strengthens it by showing us that true tolerance is not about accepting everything, but about standing firm in defense of what matters most. Value paradox: why is water, which is essential for life, so cheap, while diamonds, which have no real survival value, are so expensive? This is the value paradox, also known as the diamond water paradox, and it challenges how we think about worth, utility, and the things we value in life. First, articulated by Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, this paradox has puzzled thinkers for centuries, revealing surprising truths about human decision-making and the nature of a value. To understand the value paradox, let's start with the basics. Water is vital. We need it to drink, to grow food, to clean, to survive. Without water, life, as we know, would end. Diamonds, on the other hand, are essentially luxury items. They're used for adornment, industrial tools, and symbolic gestures like engagement rings. But you could live your entire life without ever needing a diamond. So why is it that water, which is essential, is often free or costs very little, while diamonds, which are non-essential, are staggeringly expensive? The paradox lies in the difference between two types of value: utility and exchange. Value, utility, refers to the usefulness of something, its ability to satisfy a need or want. Water has enormous utility because it's indispensable for life. Exchange value, on the other hand, refers to what something can be traded for in a market, and this is where the paradox emerges. Water has high utility but low exchange value, while diamonds have low utility but high exchange value. The resolution to this paradox lies in a concept called marginal utility, which explains how value is influenced by scarcity and context. Marginal utility is the additional satisfaction or benefit you get from consuming one more unit of something. Think of it this way: if you're stranded in the desert dying of thirst, a glass of water would be priceless. It could save your life. But if you're at home with unlimited access to clean water, an extra glass has little value because your basic needs are already met. The value of water depends not just on its overall importance, but on how much of it you already have. Diamonds, in contrast, are rare. Their scarcity means that each individual diamond has a high marginal utility because they're not easily available. People are willing to pay a premium for them, even though they don't have the life-saving utility of water. The value paradox shows us that value isn't just about necessity. It's about context, availability, and perception. This paradox has profound implications for economics and human behavior. It reveals how markets operate not on absolute value, but on relative value. People don't pay for how important something is in an abstract, since they pay for how much it's worth to them in the moment, given their needs and circumstances. This is why luxury goods, which are scarce and desirable, command high prices, even if they have little practical use. The value paradox also challenges us to think critically about the things we prioritize and pursue. It reminds us that value is often subjective, shaped by culture, society, and individual preferences. What one person sees as valuable, another might see as unnecessary. Diamonds, for example, are prized in many cultures as symbols of love, status, and wealth, but their value is largely a social construct. Water, on the other hand, is often taken for granted because of its abundance, even though it's the foundation of life itself. In modern economics, the value paradox has been resolved through the theories of supply and demand. Water is cheap because it's abundant and easy to access in most parts of the world. Diamonds are expensive because they're scarce and difficult to mine, refine, and bring to market. The interplay between supply, demand, and marginal utility creates the price differences we observe. But this resolution doesn't diminish the paradox, it deepens it. It forces us to recognize how easily scarcity and perception can distort our understanding of worth. The value paradox also holds lessons for how we think about the broader economy and global issues. Consider water again. While it may be inexpensive in places with abundant access, in drought-stricken regions or areas with poor infrastructure, clean water can become a highly valuable and even unaffordable resource. The paradox reminds us of the fragility of abundance and the importance of managing resources wisely. On a more philosophical level, the value paradox invites us to reflect on the things we truly value in life. Do we prize the essential but often invisible resources like water, air, and community, or do we chase the rare and glamorous, like diamonds and status symbols, at the expense of what really sustains us? It's a question that goes beyond economics, touching on our priorities as individuals and societies. Ultimately, the value paradox is more than a quirky economic puzzle. It's a lens through which we can explore the complexity of human choices, the intricacies of markets, and the values that shape our world. It teaches us that value is never absolute. It's always contextual, dynamic, and deeply tied to how we see ourselves and our place in the world. And perhaps that's the paradox's greatest lesson, that what we value says as much about us as it does about the things we value. Paradox of thrift. Imagine being told that saving your money, a habit you've always thought was responsible and wise, could actually harm the economy. How is that possible? This is the paradox of thrift, an econ idea that flips our understanding of personal finance on its head. It reveals a fascinating contradiction. What's good for an individual may not always be good for society as a whole, and it forces us to rethink the balance between saving and spending, especially during times of economic uncertainty. The paradox starts with a simple common sense principle: saving is good. When you save, you're setting money aside for the future, building financial security, and ensuring that you can weather unexpected expenses. But in an economy, saving doesn't happen in isolation. Your decision to save means spending less, and spending less affects the businesses and workers who depend on consumer demand. The paradox of thrift suggests that when everyone saves at the same time, it can lead to unintended consequences that ripple through the entire economy. Let's break it down. Imagine a small town where everyone suddenly decides to save more money. People stop eating out, shopping for clothes, and taking vacations. At first, this might seem like a good idea. Families are being cautious and preparing for the future. But as spending decreases, local businesses see fewer customers. Restaurants, shops, and travel agencies begin to struggle. They cut back on hiring, lay off workers, or even close their doors. With fewer jobs and less income, people have even less money to spend. The cycle feeds on itself, dragging the economy down further. This is the heart of the paradox of thrift. What's rational and beneficial for one person's saving can become harmful when everyone does it at once. It's a classic example of what economists call the fallacy of composition, where what's true for the individual isn't necessarily true for the group. While saving money might help you personally, if everyone tightens their belt simultaneously, the overall economy suffers. The paradox was popularized by British economist John Maynard Keynes during the Great Depression. Keynes argued that in times of economic downturn, the collective urge to save could make things worse. When demand falls, businesses cut production, unemployment rises, and the economy spirals downward in these situations. Keynes suggested what the economy needs isn't more saving, it's more spending. By spending money, people create demand, which drives production, creates jobs, and stimulates growth. But the paradox of thrift doesn't mean saving is always bad in a healthy economy. Saving plays an important role in fueling long-term growth. Savings become investments, funding businesses, infrastructure projects, and innovation. The paradox applies specifically to periods of economic contraction, when a sudden increase in saving can exacerbate a recession. It's a reminder that the impact of saving depends on the broader economic context. The paradox also raises important questions about the role of government in managing the economy. If individuals and businesses are cutting back during a recession, who can step in to keep demand alive? Keynes argued that this is where governments come in through public spending on projects like infrastructure, education, or healthcare. Governments can inject money into the economy, create jobs, and stimulate demand. This idea forms the basis of Keynesian economics, which has shaped how many countries respond to economic crisis. Critics of the paradox of thrift argue that it oversimplifies the complexities of an economy. Some believe that saving, even during a downturn, is ultimately beneficial because it leads to investment and future growth. Others worry that encouraging spending during a recession can lead to excessive debt, both for individuals and governments. These debates highlight the tension between short-term solutions and long-term stability, a challenge that policymakers face in every economic crisis. The paradox of thrift also has a psychological dimension. In uncertain times, fear and anxiety drive people to save more, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. This is why consumer confidence plays such a critical role in economic health. When people feel optimistic about the future, they're more likely to spend, fueling growth. When fear takes over, the economy contracts. The paradox reminds us that economics isn't just about numbers, it's about human behavior and the emotions that drive our decisions. So, what can we learn from the paradox of thrift? First, it teaches us to think critically about the relationship between individual choices and collective outcomes. It shows that actions that seem responsible on a personal level can have unintended consequences when scaled up. Second, it highlights the importance of balance. Saving and spending are both essential, but their impact depends on timing and context. And finally, it underscores the interconnectedness of an economy. No one acts in isolation. Our decisions affect others, and their decisions affect us in a world that often celebrates individual responsibility. The paradox of thrift challenges us to think collectively. It reminds us that the health of an economy depends not just on what we do for ourselves, but on how we contribute to the broader system. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that economics isn't just about dollars and cents, it's about the choices we make and the values we share as a society. So the next time you're deciding whether to save or spend, remember, it's not just a personal decision, it's part of a much larger story, and that's what makes the paradox of thrift so life-changing. It forces us to see the bigger picture, to think beyond ourselves, and to navigate the delicate balance between individual and collective well-being. Barbera paradox. Imagine a small town with a peculiar rule. There is only one barber, and this barber shaves everyone in town who does not shave themselves. The rule is simple and absolute. The barber must shave all those who don't shave themselves, and only those who don't shave themselves. But here's the question: who shaves the barber? At first glance, it seems like there should be a straightforward answer, but as you think it through, the situation becomes impossible. If the barber shaves himself, he violates the rule, because the barber is only supposed to shave those who don't shave themselves. But if the barber doesn't shave himself, then he must follow the rule and shave himself, because he shaves everyone who doesn't. No matter how you approach it, the barber ends up trapped in a logical contradiction. This is the barber paradox. The barber paradox was introduced by British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell to illustrate a deeper issue in the foundations of logic and mathematics. On the surface, it's a playful thought experiment, but it actually points to a serious problem: what happens when a set or system refers to itself? In this case, the barber shaving rule creates a self-referential loop that cannot be resolved without breaking its own logic to understand the paradox more deeply. Let's step back and look at what's happening here, the barber's job is defined by a rule. He must shave all and only those who do not shave themselves. This rule divides the townspeople into two groups, those who shave themselves and those who don't. But when we try to include the barber in one of these groups, the rule collapses. If he shave himself, he belongs to the group of people who shave themselves, which means he shouldn't be shaving himself. If he doesn't shave himself, he belongs to the group of people who don't shave themselves, which means he should shave himself. There's no way for the barber to follow the rule without creating a contradiction at its core. The barber paradox is about self-reference, what happens when a rule or system applies to itself. It's a close relative of the liar's paradox, where a statement like this sentence is false creates a similar loop of contradiction. Both paradoxes show how self-reference can break the rules of logic, creating situations where no consistent solution exists. But the barber paradox isn't just a quirky thought experiment. It has profound implications for mathematics, philosophy, and even computer science. Bertrand Russell used it to highlight a problem with set theory, a branch of mathematics that deals with collections of objects. In the early 20th century, mathematicians believed that any logical statement about sets should make sense. For example, you could talk about the set of all chairs or the set of all numbers, but Russell noticed a problem when he considered the set of all sets that your understanding of the elves. At first, this idea seems harmless. Most sets don't contain themselves. For example, the set of all apples doesn't include itself. It's a set, not an apple. But when you try to define the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, you run into a problem. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then by definition it shouldn't. And if it doesn't, then by definition it should. This contradiction, known as Russell's paradox, shook the foundations of mathematics and forced mathematicians to rethink how they define sets and logical systems. The barber paradox is a simplified version of this problem. Designed to make the issue easier to understand, it shows how seemingly simple rules can create profound contradictions when they're applied to themselves. This has practical implications far beyond mathematics. In computer science, for example, self-referential systems can create bugs or crashes. A program that tries to analyze itself might run into infinite loops or contradictions. Just like the barber, the paradox also has philosophical implications, especially when it comes to understanding the limits of logic and language. We often assume that logic is the ultimate tool for making sense of the world, but paradoxes like this one show that even logic has its boundaries. Self-reference is everywhere in human thought, from the way we describe ourselves to the way we construct systems of rules. The barber paradox reminds us that these systems are not always as solid as they seem. So what's the solution to the barber paradox? The short answer is that there isn't one. Not within the rules of the paradox itself. The only way to resolve the contradiction is to change the rules. In the case of mathematics, Russell's paradox led to the development of new systems like set theories that avoid self-referential definitions. In everyday life, the lesson is that some problems can't be solved within their own frameworks. Sometimes the only way to move forward is to step back and rethink the assumptions that created the problem in the first place. The barber paradox may seem like a small, playful puzzle, but it opens the door to some of the most profound questions about logic, reasoning, and the way we make sense of the world. It challenges us to think critically about the systems we create and the assumptions we take for granted. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that even the simplest idea can contain hidden depths, paradoxes that force us to see the world in a completely new way. Dichotomy paradox. Imagine you're about to walk across a room. Simple, right? But before you can reach the other side, you have to cover half the distance. Then, to cover the remaining half, you have to travel half of that distance, and then half of that, and so on. Suddenly you're trapped in an infinite series of steps, each smaller than the last. If you can't complete an infinite number of tasks, how can you ever reach the other side? Welcome to the dichotomy paradox, one of the most famous thought experiments introduced by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Ala. At first glance, the paradox seems absurd. Of course, we can cross the room. We do it every day without a second thought. But the dichotomy paradox challenges us to think more deeply about the nature of motion, infinity, and how we understand the passage of time. and space Zeno's paradox has fascinated thinkers for centuries because it asks a question that seems simple but reveals profound complexities about the way the universe works. Let's break it down. The paradox starts with the idea that to move from point A to point B, you must first reach the halfway point, but to get to the halfway point, you must first reach the quarter point, and to get there you must reach the eighth point, and so on. This creates an infinite sequence of smaller and smaller steps that you must complete. The problem is that completing an infinite number of tasks seems impossible. If there are infinitely many steps, how can motion ever occur? How can you ever take the first step, let alone reach your destination? The paradox highlights a fascinating conflict between our everyday experience and the logical implications of dividing space and time into infinitely small parts. In reality, we have no trouble crossing rooms, walking down streets, or traveling great distances, but Zeno's paradox forces us to confront a deeper question. How do we reconcile the idea of infinite divisibility with the fact that motion clearly happens one way? To approach this is through the concept of an infinite series. Mathematically, the distances described in the paradox, half, then a quarter, then an eighth, and so on, form a convergent series. When you add up all these fractions, there's some approaches a finite number, the total distance between point A and point B. In other words, even though the series involves infinitely many terms, the total distance remains finite. This mathematical insight resolves the paradox on a practical level, showing that the infinite steps Zeno describes can indeed be completed in a finite amount of time. But Zeno's dichotomy paradox isn't just a mathematical puzzle. It also raises philosophical questions about the nature of reality. If space and time can be infinitely divided, does that mean they're made up of infinitely small parts, or is there a fundamental limit to how far we can divide them? These questions lie at the heart of debates about the nature of the universe, from ancient philosophy to modern physics. In the 20th century, quantum mechanics and relativity added new layers to this discussion. Quantum mechanics suggests that space and time may not be infinitely divisible, but instead have a smallest possible unit, known as the Planck length and Planck time. These fundamental limits challenge the idea of infinite divisibility and offer a potential resolution to Zeno's paradox. On a physical level, if there's a smallest possible step, then the infinite sequence of smaller and smaller steps described in the paradox simply doesn't exist in the real world. At the same time, Einstein's theory of relativity revolutionized our understanding of space and time by showing that they're not separate entities, but part of a single interconnected fabric. Motion, according to relativity, is not about objects moving through absolute space, but about changes in the relationships between objects in space-time. This perspective shifts the focus of Zeno's paradox, suggesting that motion might be better understood as a continuous process rather than a series of discrete steps. The dichotomy paradox also has implications for how we think about infinity itself. Infinity is a concept that challenges human intuition. It's not just a very large number, but a fundamentally different kind of quantity. Zeno's paradox forces us to confront the idea that infinity can appear in the smallest details of motion as well as in the vastness of space and time. It reminds us that even the most ordinary experiences, like walking across a room, can contain mysteries that stretch the limits of our understanding. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the dichotomy paradox is what it reveals about the relationship between logic and reality. On a purely logical level, the paradox suggests that motion is impossible, yet we know from experience that motion happens all the time. This tension highlights the limitations of human reasoning and the importance of testing ideas against the real world. It reminds us that while logic and mathematics are powerful tools for understanding the universe, they're not the whole story. Zeno's dichotomy paradox is more than just a thought experiment. It's a gateway to some of the deepest questions about the nature of reality, motion, and infinity. It challenges us to think critically about the assumptions we take for granted and to explore the mysteries hidden in everyday experiences. And perhaps that's why it continues to captivate us, because it shows us that even the simplest act of crossing a room can open the door to an infinite world of possibilities. Hedonism paradox. What if the harder you chase happiness, the further away it gets? This is the hedonism paradox, a fascinating and counterintuitive concept that challenges our most basic assumptions about pleasure, happiness, and the pursuit of a meaningful life. At its core, the paradox reveals a strange truth. When you make pleasure your ultimate goal, it often eludes you. But why does this happen, and what does it teach us about the nature of happiness? Let's start by unpacking what hedonism means. Hedonism is the philosophical idea that pleasure is the highest good, the ultimate purpose of life. On the surface, it seems logical. After all, who doesn't want to be happy? Whether it's enjoying a delicious meal, listening to beautiful music, or spending time with loved ones, pleasure is a universal human experience. Hedonism suggests that we should maximize these experiences to lead the best possible life, but the hedonism paradox turns this idea on its head. It suggests that the more you focus on pleasure as an end in itself, the harder it becomes to attain. Imagine this: you're at a party determined to have the best time ever. You carefully plan every detail, what to wear, who to talk to, and even what you'll eat and drink. But as the night goes on, you find yourself constantly evaluating whether you're having fun. You compare your experience to others, worry that you're not doing enough, and end up feeling disappointed the more you try to force happiness, the less you enjoy yourself. This is the hedonism paradox in action. It's not that pleasure is bad, it's that fixating on it can backfire. The paradox occurs because happiness is often a byproduct of other activities, not something you can achieve directly. When you focus too much on being happy, you become overly self-conscious and start analyzing your feelings. This self-awareness creates pressure and anxiety, making it harder to relax and enjoy the moment. In psychological terms, this is known as the paradoxical effect. By focusing too much on the outcome, happiness, you lose sight of the process, which is where true joy often resides. Philosophers and psychologists have explored this paradox for centuries. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, famously wrote that happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue as a result of living a meaningful life. Frankl's idea suggests that when we shift our focus away from chasing pleasure and toward engaging in meaningful activities, happiness tends to follow naturally. This aligns with modern research in positive psychology, which shows that people who prioritize purpose and connection over pleasure often report higher levels of life satisfaction. But the hedonism paradox doesn't mean that pleasure is unimportant. It highlights the need for balance. Pleasure is a vital part of life, but it's best experienced indirectly. For example, think about a hobby you love: painting, hiking, or playing music. When you're fully immersed in the activity, you're not thinking about how happy it's making you. You're simply enjoying the experience. Paradoxically, this lack of focus on happiness often leads to deeper and more lasting joy. The paradox also raises important questions about modern society. We live in a culture that constantly encourages us to seek happiness through consumerism, social media, and self-help advice. Advertisements promise that the right car, vacation, or gadget will make us happy. Social media bombards us with curated images of other people's seemingly perfect lives, fueling the idea that happiness is something we should always be chasing. But the hedonism paradox reminds us that this constant pursuit can be self-defeating. It challenges us to rethink what it means to live a fulfilling life and to resist the pressure to measure our worth by how happy we appear to be. So, how can we escape the trap of the hedonism paradox? One approach is to focus on intrinsic goals rather than extrinsic ones. Intrinsic goals are things we value for their own sake, like personal growth, relationships, and creativity. Extrinsic goals like money, status, or appearance are often pursued because we think they'll bring us happiness. Research shows that people who prioritize intrinsic goals tend to be happier and more fulfilled because they're not chasing external validation. Another strategy is to cultivate mindfulness, the practice of being fully present in the moment. Mindfulness helps us let go of the constant need to evaluate our experiences and instead allows us to simply enjoy them. By focusing on what we're doing rather than how it makes us feel, we can break free from the self-consciousness that fuels the paradox. The hedonism paradox also invites us to embrace the full range of human emotions. Happiness is just one piece of the puzzle. Life is made up of highs and lows, joy and sorrow, excitement and boredom. By accepting all of these experiences as part of the human condition, we can find a deeper sense of peace and contentment. Paradoxically, when we stop trying so hard to be happy, We often find that happiness sneaks up on us when we least expect it in the end. The hedonism par parks isn't just a puzzle about pleasure, it's a profound lesson about how to live. It teaches us that happiness isn't something we can grab or hold on to, it's something we discover in the act of living fully and authentically. It reminds us to shift our focus from chasing happiness to creating a life that's rich with meaning, connection, and purpose. So the next time you feel the pressure to be happy, remember the lesson of the hedonism paradox. Let go of the chase, immerse yourself in the moment, and trust that joy will find you in its own time. After all, happiness is less about where you're going and more about how you're traveling, and sometimes the best way to find it is to stop searching and simply live. Soothe paradox. How many grains of sand make a heap? One grain certainly isn't a heap, two grains aren't either. But what if you keep adding grains one at a time? At what exact point does the pile of sand become a heap? This question lies at the heart of the Soothe paradox, a fascinating thought experiment that reveals how seemingly simple ideas can unravel into profound complexity. At first glance, the paradox seems easy to dismiss. After all, you might say a heap is just a general term. It doesn't need to be precise. But the moment you start asking where the line is drawn, things get tricky. If one grain doesn't make a heap and adding one more grain doesn't suddenly transform into a heap, does that mean no amount of grains can ever form a heap? This slippery slope of reasoning challenges not just how we define heaps of sand, but how we deal with vague concepts in general. The Soothe paradox takes its name from the Greek word soros, meaning heap, and has puzzled philosophers for centuries. It isn't just about sand, it's about how we define anything that lacks clear boundaries. Think about baldness. At what point does a person with thinning hair become bald? Or consider wealth. How many dollars do you need to go from being poor to rich? These questions seem trivial at first, but reveal a deeper truth about the limits of language and reasoning. The paradox exposes a fundamental problem with vague concepts. They resist precise definitions. Words like heap, bald, or rich are useful because they allow us to talk about general ideas without needing exact measurements. But when pushed to their limits, these concepts become ambiguous. The Soothe paradox forces us to confront this ambiguity and question how we can make sense of a world filled with fuzzy boundaries. Answers, but Thoreau's paradox is by introducing the idea of degrees or gradual change. Instead of thinking in absolutes, heap or not a heap, we could think in terms of probabilities or thresholds. For instance, we might say that as the number of grains increases, the likelihood of the pile being considered a heap gradually rises. This approach avoids drawing a hard line, but raises another question: how do we decide where to place these thresholds? Even with degrees, the problem of vagueness remains. Another proposed solution is to embrace the idea of context. In some contexts, a pile of 50 grains might be called a heap, while in others it might not. For example, if you're talking about grains of sand on a beach, a small pile might not qualify as a heap, but if you're looking at grains on a table, even a tiny pile might seem like a heap by comparison. This context-dependent view acknowledges that definitions are flexible, shaped by the situations in which they're used. The Soothe paradox doesn't just challenge how we think about words, it has real-world implications. Take laws, for example. Many legal systems rely on vague concepts like reasonable doubt or excessive force. These terms are intentionally left flexible to accommodate different situations, but they also create room for interpretation and disagreement. The paradox reminds us that while vagueness can be useful, it can also lead to uncertainty and conflict. Similarly, the Soothe paradox applies to social and ethical questions. Consider climate change. At what point does a gradual increase in temperature become a crisis? Or think about social issues like inequality. How much disparity is too much? These are not just abstract questions, they influence how we respond to some of the most pressing challenges of our time. The Soothe paradox forces us to confront the fact that many of these problems don't have clear-cut solutions, but perhaps the most profound lesson of the Soothe paradox is what it reveals about our need for clarity. In a messy, ambiguous world, we like to think in categories, dividing things into neat boxes. This is a heap, this isn't, this is bald, this isn't. But the world rarely conforms to such clear distinctions. The Soothe paradox challenges us to embrace complexity and uncertainty, recognizing That many of the concepts we use are imprecise by nature. In the end, the Sorites paradox isn't just about grains of sand or fuzzy definitions. It's a reminder of how we navigate the gray areas of life. It teaches us that ambiguity is not a flaw in our thinking, but a reflection of the world's complexity, and perhaps that's what makes this paradox so life-changing. It shows us that the search for clarity often leads not to answers, but to deeper questions, pushing us to think critically about the words we use, the decisions we make, and the way we understand the world. Crocodile paradox. Let's suppose your child has been snatched by a crocodile. You're standing at the edge of a river, your heart pounding, your breath shallow. The crocodile looks at you with its cold, unblinking eyes and says, "I will return your child if and only if you can correctly guess what I will do next." At this moment, your world freezes. You realize this isn't just a life or death situation. It's a logical trap. No matter what you answer, you're stepping into a paradox. This dilemma has baffled philosophers and thinkers for centuries. It's not just a puzzle about a predator and its prey. It's a profound exploration of knowledge, logic, and the limits of certainty. Let's carefully walk through this tangled web of reasoning. You have two possible answers to give the crocodile. Consider the first scenario. In this scenario, you predict that the crocodile will return your child. If the crocodile plans to return your child, your prediction is correct, and the crocodile fulfills its promise. Everything aligns, and your child is safe. But if the crocodile plans to keep your child, your prediction is wrong, and the crocodile isn't bound to return the child. In this scenario, everything remains logically consistent, because the outcome depends entirely on whether your prediction aligns with the crocodile's intention. The real paradox emerges in the second scenario. In this scenario, you predict that the crocodile will not return your child. If the crocodile plans to keep the child, your prediction is correct, but now the crocodile is forced to return the child because your prediction was accurate. This creates a contradiction because the crocodile cannot both keep the child and honor its promise to return them when your prediction is correct. On the other hand, if the crocodile plans to return the child, your prediction is wrong, and by the terms of the deal, the crocodile should not have returned the child in the first place. In either case, the crocodile is trapped in a logical contradiction. So, what's really going on? Here, the crocodile paradox is a classic example of a self-referential paradox where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates an impossible situation. It's similar to the famous liar's paradox, where someone says this statement is false. If the statement is true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. The crocodile paradox operates on this same slippery logic where the crocodile's promise collapses under its own weight, but beyond the logical puzzle, the crocodile paradox also raises deeper philosophical questions. At its core, it's about the nature of promises, truth, and trust. If a promise creates a scenario where it cannot logically be kept, is it really a promise at all? And if a situation is built on contradictory rules, can any outcome truly be fair? Or just in a way, the paradox reflects real-world situations where agreements are made under flawed premises. Think about legal contracts filled with loopholes, political promises built on conflicting conditions, or even personal dilemmas where every choice seems to backfire. The crocodile paradox isn't just a brain teaser. It's a mirror reflecting the complexity and imperfection of the promises we make and the expectations we set. But let's not forget the crocodile in this story. The paradox also reveals something about power and control. The crocodile isn't just a passive participant in this riddle. It's the architect of the trap. By setting the rules in a way that guarantees contradiction, the crocodile ensures that no answer can fully satisfy the agreement. In a sense, it represents authority structures or systems where the rules are intentionally rigged to maintain control, even in the face of logic and fairness. So can this paradox ever be solved? Philosophers have debated this question for centuries, and the general consensus is no, the paradox isn't meant to have a resolution, because it's not about finding an answer, it's about understanding the problem. It's a thought experiment designed to expose the limits of language, logic, and our assumptions about fairness and promises, but perhaps the real lesson of the crocodile paradox is this: not every question has an answer, not every problem can be untangled through pure reasoning, and sometimes the power lies not in solving the puzzle, but in recognizing the trap it creates. So if you ever find yourself face to face with a crocodile offering a deal that seems impossible to fulfill, remember this paradox. Sometimes the game is rigged from the start, and the only winning move is to recognize the paradox for what it is. A cleverly constructed trap hiding behind the illusion of choice. Pinocchio paradox. What happens when Pinocchio says, "My nose will now grow"? Will it grow, or will it not? At first glance, this might sound like a clever riddle, but it's actually a deep philosophical and logical puzzle known as the Pinocchio paradox. It challenges our understanding of truth, lies, and self-reference in a way that is both deceptively simple and profoundly mind-bending. Let's start with Pinocchio's unique situation. He's a wooden puppet brought to life, and his nose grows every time he tells a lie. Now, if Pinocchio says, "My nose will now grow," we're caught in a paradox. If his nose does grow, it means he was telling the truth. But if he was telling the truth, his nose shouldn't grow because it only grows when he lies. On the other hand, if his nose doesn't grow, it means he was lying. But if he was lying, his nose should grow no matter how you approach it. Pinocchio's statement creates a logical contradiction that cannot be resolved. This paradox belongs to a family of self-referential puzzles, much like the famous liar's paradox, where someone says this sentence is false. Both paradoxes highlight the challenges of self-reference, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates a loop of contradiction. But the Pinocchio paradox has a unique twist. It ties this logical contradiction to a physical consequence, making it feel more tangible and even more perplexing. To fully appreciate the Pinocchio paradox, we need to explore what makes it so puzzling. The key lies in a relationship between truth, lies, and cause and effect. In Pinocchio's world, lies have a direct, measurable outcome. His nose grows. This cause and effect relationship seems straightforward until you introduce a self-referential statement like, "My nose will now grow." At that point, the logic breaks down because the outcome determines the truth of the statement, but the truth of the statement also determines the outcome. It's a feedback loop that defies resolution. What makes the Pinocchio paradox so fascinating is how it challenges the way we think about language and reality. In our everyday lives, we rely on language to describe the world around us. Statements are either true or false, and we assume there is a clear distinction between the two. But the Pinocchio paradox shows that this distinction isn't always so clear. When language refers to itself, it can create situations where truth and falsehood blur together, leaving us with no clear answers. Philosophically, the Pinocchio paradox raises profound questions about the nature of truth and meaning. What does it mean for a statement to be true or false? Can something be both true and false at the same time? These questions have been debated by philosophers for centuries, and the Pinocchio paradox brings them into sharp focus. It forces us to confront the limits of our understanding and consider the possibility that truth might be more complex than we often assume. The paradox also has implications for logic and mathematics, particularly in the study of formal systems. In the early 20th century, mathematician Kurt Gödel proved that any sufficiently complex formal system contains statements that cannot be proven true or false within the system itself. The Pinocchio paradox is a playful reminder of this limitation, showing how self-reference can create problems that defy resolution. But the Pinocchio paradox isn't just an abstract puzzle, it also has real-world relevance. It highlights the challenges of dealing with self-referential systems, which appear in fields ranging from computer science to law. For example, a computer program that tries to analyze its own code can run into loops or contradictions, much like Pinocchio's statement. Similarly, legal systems sometimes create rules that conflict with themselves, leading to situations where it's impossible to determine the correct outcome. The paradox also has a psychological dimension. It reflects the human tendency to overanalyze and second-guess ourselves, especially when faced with complex or contradictory situations, just as Pinocchio's statement ties itself in knots. Our own thoughts can sometimes create mental loops that are difficult to escape. The paradox serves as a reminder to approach such situations with curiosity and humility, recognizing that not every problem has a clear or simple solution. So what can we learn from the Pinocchio paradox? First, it teaches us to question our assumptions about truth, logic, and language. It shows that even the most basic ideas can become profoundly complex when viewed from a new perspective. Second, it challenges us to think critically about self-reference and the limitations of our understanding. And finally, it reminds us that paradoxes aren't just problems to be solved, they're opportunity to explore the mysteries of thought, language, and reality. In the end, the Pinocchio paradox isn't just about a wooden puppet with a growing nose. It's a doorway into some of the deepest questions about how we make sense of the world. It invites us to embrace complexity, to think beyond the surface, and to see the beauty in the puzzles that make life so endlessly fascinating. So the next time you hear Pinocchio say, "My nose will now grow," remember, it's not just a clever riddle, it's a journey into the very heart of logic and meaning. Sword and shield paradox. Imagine a merchant boasting about his incredible weapons. This sword, he says, is so sharp it can cut through anything. Then he picks up a shield and declares, "And this shield is so strong, it can block any attack." A curious onlooker raises a hand and asks, "What happens if your sword strikes your shield?" The merchant freezes, realizing the contradiction. This is the sword and shield paradox, also known as the paradox of the irresistible force and the immovable object. It's a thought experiment that seems simple, but reveals profound truths about logic, language, and the limits of absolute claims. The paradox originates from ancient China, where a merchant's exaggerated claims about his unbeatable sword and unbreakable shield were met with the same question. What happens when they meet? The paradox highlights an inherent contradiction. Both claims can't be true at the same time. If the sword can cut through anything, it must pierce the shield, but if the shield can block anything, it must stop the sword. The two absolute qualities cancel each other out, creating an impossible situation on the surface. This seems like a clever puzzle, but it's more than that. The sword and shield paradox forces us to confront the limitations of absolutes. Absolute claims like this sword can cut through anything or this shield can block anything are appealing because they sound definitive and powerful, but when two absolutes collide, they expose the flaws in their logic. The paradox reminds us that the world is rarely as black and white as absolute statements make it seem. One of the most interesting aspects of a sword and shield paradox is how it applies to real-world situations. Think about debates or arguments where two opposing ideas claim to be entirely correct. For example, what happens when a need for absolute security collides with the demand for absolute freedom? Both ideals sound appealing on their own, but when pushed to their extremes, they can't coexist. The paradox shows us the value of nuance and compromise, reminding us that absolutes are often unrealistic in a complex world. The paradox also has implications for logic and reasoning. It exposes the limits of systems that rely on contradictions. Informal logic statements that contradict themselves are considered invalid or nonsensical. The sword and shield paradox illustrates this by creating a scenario where language breaks down. If a sword can cut through anything and a shield can block anything, the words anything lose their meaning when applied together. The paradox challenges us to think critically about the assumptions and definitions we use in reasoning. Philosophically, the paradox raises questions about the nature of power and limits. What does it mean for something to be truly unstoppable or immovable in physics? For example, the idea of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object is often used as a metaphor for conflicting principles, but in reality, the concept doesn't make sense within the laws of the universe. If such a force and object existed, one would cancel out the other, showing that even in theory, absolute have boundaries. The sword and shield paradox also has a psychological dimension. It reflects the human tendency to make exaggerated claims or seek certainty in an uncertain world. Whether it's advertising, politics, or personal beliefs, we often encounter statements that promise absolutes. The paradox teaches us to approach these claims with skepticism, recognizing that the truth is often more complex than it appears. Interestingly, the paradox is closely related to other famous thought experiments like the liar's paradox, where a statement contradicts itself. This sentence is false. Both paradoxes reveal how language and logic can create situations that defy resolution. They challenge us to question the way we think and communicate, showing that even the most straightforward ideas can lead to profound puzzles. So what's the solution to the sword and shield paradox? The short answer is that there isn't one, not within the framework of the paradox itself. The contradiction is built into the scenario, making it impossible to resolve without abandoning one of the claim. This lack of resolution is what makes the paradox so powerful. It forces us to confront the limitations of our understanding and embrace the complexity of the world. The sword and shield paradox isn't just a quirky puzzle, it's a tool for critical thinking. It reminds us to question absolutes, seek nuance, and recognize the limits of logic and language in a world that often values certainty and simplicity. The paradox encourages us to embrace ambiguity and complexity, showing that the most interesting questions are often the ones without clear answers. In the end, the sword and shield paradox isn't about weapons or warriors. It's about the collision of ideas, the nature of contradiction, and the search for truth. It challenges us to think beyond the surface, to question what we take for granted, and to see the world not in absolutes, but in possibilities. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all, that true understanding comes not from resolving paradoxes, but from learning to live with them. Friendship paradox. Why do your friends seem to have more friends than you? It's not just in your head, it's a real phenomenon called the friendship paradox. This counterintuitive idea suggests that on average your friends are more popular than you are. How is that possible? And more importantly, what does it reveal about the way we interact, connect, and compare ourselves to others? Let's start with the math behind the paradox. Imagine a social network, not the kind on your phone, but the web of connections that links people together. Some individuals have only a few friends, while others are social butterflies connected to dozens or even hundreds of people. The friendship paradox emerges because people with lots of friends are more likely to be your friends. Why? Think of it this way. If someone has 100 friends, they have 100 chances to be connected to you, while someone with only 2 friends has just 2 chances. In a network, the popular people act as hubs, disproportionately influencing the average number of friends. Your friends have this mathematical quirk, means that when you compare yourself to your friends, you're more likely to be comparing yourself to someone with above average popularity. And because of this bias, your friends on average will seem to have more connections than you do. The paradox isn't just about self-perception, it's a reflection of how networks operate, from social circles to the internet. But the friendship paradox doesn't stop at numbers. It has profound psychological and social implications, especially in an age dominated by social media. When we scroll through platforms like Instagram or Facebook, we often see the highlights of other people's lives, vacations, parties, achievements shared by our most connected friends. This creates the illusion that everyone else is more popular, more successful, or more interesting than we are. The friendship paradox explains why this illusion is so pervasive. We're naturally more exposed to the lives of the most connected individuals, amplifying the sense of comparison. This can have a significant impact on mental health. Research shows that social comparison is a key driver of anxiety, envy, and even depression. The friendship paradox reminds us that these comparisons are often based on a distorted perspective. Your friends might seem more connected, but that's largely because of how networks work, not because you're less valuable or less connected yourself. Interestingly, the friendship paradox isn't just a curiosity, it has practical applications in public health. For example, it's used to identify influential individuals in social networks. During a disease outbreak, health officials might target vaccination campaigns or public health messages to people who are more connected, as they're more likely to influence others. By leveraging the paradox, we can improve the spread of helpful information and curb the spread of harmful misinformation or diseases. The paradox also sheds light on the dynamics of influence and inequality in networks. In any network, whether it's a group of friends, a professional community, or a social media platform, connections aren't distributed evenly. A small number of individuals often hold a disproportionate amount of influence. The friendship paradox reveals how this inequality shapes our perceptions, interactions, and even opportunities. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the friendship paradox is what it teaches us About perspective, it reminds us that our view of the world is always partially shaped by the connections and relationships we have. Just as your friends seem more popular, your perception of other aspects of life, success, happiness, or wealth, might be skewed by the people you're exposed to. The paradox invites us to question these perceptions, to recognize their limitations, and to focus on what truly matters. The friendship paradox isn't just about numbers, it's about understanding how we relate to others and how networks influence our lives. It challenges us to rethink the way we compare ourselves to others, to see beyond the surface of popularity, and to appreciate the unique connections we have. Because in the end, it's not about how many friends you have, it's about the depth, meaning, and quality of those relationships. And no paradox can take that away from you. Grand Hotel Paradox. Imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. Every single room is occupied, yet somehow the hotel can still accommodate new guests. How is this possible? This is the Grand Hotel Paradox, a thought experiment introduced by German mathematician David Hilbert, and it's one of the most mind-bending ways to understand infinity. It challenges our intuitive understanding of numbers and space, forcing us to rethink what infinity really means. Picture the Grand Hotel. Every room has a number 1, 2, 3, and so on, and all the rooms are filled with guests. A traveler arrives at the front desk and asks for a room. The receptionist, without hesitation, smiles and says, "Of course we have space, but how if every room is occupied? Where will the new guest stay?" Here's the trick. The receptionist asks every current guest to move to the next room. The person in room 1 moves to room 2. The person in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on. This frees up room 1, which is now available for the new guest. Remarkably, even though the hotel was full, it made space without turning anyone away. That's the strange logic of infinity. There's always room for more, but the paradox doesn't stop there. What if a bus arrives carrying an infinite number of new guests? Surely even an infinite hotel couldn't handle that, right? Yet the Grand Hotel can. This time the receptionist asks each current guest to move to a room number that's double their current one. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2. The guest in room 2 moves to room 4. The guest in room 3 moves to room 6, and so on. This leaves all the odd-numbered rooms, an infinite number of them, empty and ready for the new arrivals. The hotel accommodates infinity within infinity, a concept that feels impossible, but works perfectly within the rules of mathematics. So what does this paradox teach us? First, it reveals that infinity is not just a really large number. It's a completely different kind of quantity. In our everyday lives, numbers are finite and behave predictably, but infinity breaks those rules. In the Grand Hotel, full doesn't mean no more room, and adding to infinity doesn't make it bigger. It's already infinite. The paradox also highlights the difference between potential infinity and actual infinity. Potential infinity is the idea of a process that could go on forever, like counting numbers. Actual infinity, on the other hand, refers to a completed infinite set, like the total number of rooms. In the Grand Hotel, Hilbert's thought experiment forces us to confront the strangeness of actual infinity, where our normal understanding of addition, subtraction, and space no longer applies. But there's more. The Grand Hotel Paradox also has profound implications for our understanding of the universe. In physics, for example, infinity appears in theories about the cosmos, black holes, and even the nature of time. Hilbert's paradox reminds us that infinity isn't just a mathematical curiosity, it's a concept that shapes how we understand reality itself. Yet the paradox also raises philosophical questions. If infinity behaves so differently from finite numbers, can we ever truly comprehend it? The Grand Hotel feels absurd because it conflicts with our everyday intuition. It shows us that the human mind struggles to grasp infinity, even though it's a central idea in man and science. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Grand Hotel Paradox is how it applies to modern mathematics. The paradox is rooted in set theory, a branch of math that explores collections of objects. Mathematicians like Gord Kaner, who pioneered the study of infinity, showed that there are different sizes of infinity. The set of whole numbers, for example, is infinite, but it's smaller than the set of real numbers, which includes fractions and decimals. The Grand Hotel illustrates one of these infinities, known as countable Infinity, where you can list all the elements in a sequence like the rooms in the hotel. The paradox even connects to practical problems like computer science algorithms that deal with infinite processes like searching through massive data sets, often rely on principles similar to the Grand Hotel. By breaking infinite problems into manageable steps, we can apply the logic of Hilbert's Hotel to solve challenges in technology and beyond. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Grand Hotel paradox is how it challenges us to think differently. Infinity is a concept that defies common sense, but it's also a gateway to deeper understanding. It forces us to question our assumptions and explore ideas that stretch the limits of imagination. The Grand Hotel paradox may seem like a quirky mathematical puzzle, but it's a profound exploration of the nature of infinity. It shows us that the universe, and even reality itself, is far stranger and more complex than we often realize, and in the process it reminds us that some questions don't have simple answers, but they can still open the door to endless possibilities. Ur's paradox: look up at the night sky, it's filled with stars, but there's so much darkness between them. Have you ever wondered why, if the universe is infinite and filled with stars, shouldn't the sky be blazing with light with no room for darkness? This is Ober's paradox, a mystery that has puzzled scientists and philosophers for centuries. It's a question that seems simple but leads to profound insights about the nature of the universe, its age, and its structure. The paradox is named after Heinrich Wilhelm Ehlers, a 19th-century German astronomer who popularized the idea. Though versions of it have been discussed earlier, at its core, the paradox asks this: if the universe is infinite, eternal, idle, and uniformly filled with stars, then every line of sight should eventually land on the surface of a star. This would mean that the entire night sky should glow as brightly as the surface of the sun, but instead, we see vast stretches of darkness. Why? To understand why this is such a puzzle, imagine standing in a dense forest. No matter which direction you look, your line of sight eventually lands on a tree trunk. In an infinite universe filled with stars, the same logic should apply. Every direction should lead to the surface of a star, yet the night sky is mostly dark. This contradiction between theory and observation is what makes Ober's paradox so fascinating. For centuries, scientists proposed different explanations. One idea was that dust and gas in space might block the light from distant stars, preventing it from reaching us. But this doesn't work. Over time, interstellar dust would heat up and begin to glow, filling the sky with light. Anyway, another suggestion was that the stars might simply be too far away, with their light dimming as it traveled across vast distances. But in an infinite universe, the number of stars increases without limit, meaning their combined light should overcome any dimming. These early attempts to solve the paradox only deepen the mystery. The breakthrough came in the 20th century with the discovery that the universe is neither infinite nor eternal in the way previously imagined. Instead, it has a finite age, around 138 billion years, and it's expanding. These two facts are key to resolving Ober's paradox. First, let's consider the universe's age. If the universe is 138 billion years old, then light from stars more than 138 billion light years away hasn't had enough time to reach us. The finite age of the universe limits the number of stars we can see, creating gaps of dark in the sky. In other words, the observable universe is not infinite, it's bounded by the speed of light and the universe's age. Second, the universe's expansion plays a crucial role. As the universe expands, the light from distant stars and galaxies is stretched into longer wavelengths, a phenomenon known as redshift. This stretching moves the light out of the visible spectrum, making it invisible to the human eye. What we perceive as darkness is often light that has shifted into infrared or radio wavelengths. These two insights, the finite age of the universe and its expansion, transform Ober's paradox from a mystery into a powerful tool for understanding the cosmos. They reveal that the dark night sky is not a flaw in the universe's design, but a window into its history and structure. But the paradox doesn't end there. It also raises deeper philosophical and existential questions. The darkness of a night sky reminds us that the universe is vast, and much of it lies beyond our ability to perceive. It's a humbling realization, forcing us to confront the limits of human knowledge and the scale of the cosmos. Interestingly, What we do see when we look at the night sky is evidence of the universe's origins. The faint glow of the cosmic microwave background radiation remnants of the Big Bang fills the sky. Even in its darkest parts, this background radiation is a direct result of the universe's finite age and expansion, providing a subtle but profound answer. To Euler's paradox, it's a reminder that the darkness we see isn't empty, it's filled with the story of the universe's birth and evolution. Euler's paradox also highlights the interconnectedness of science. Solving it required insights from astronomy, physics, and cosmology, showing how different fields come together to answer fundamental questions. It's a testament to the power of human curiosity and our ability to piece together the mysteries of the universe. So what does Euler's paradox teach us? First, it reminds us to question our assumptions. The idea of an infinite, eternal universe seemed intuitive for centuries, but closer examination revealed its flaws. Second, it shows us the value of looking beyond the surface. The darkness of the night sky isn't just absence, it's evidence of the universe's dynamic history. And finally, it inspires us to keep exploring, to push the boundaries of what we know, and to embrace the wonder of the unknown. In the end, Euler's paradox is more than just a question about the night sky. It's a journey into the nature of existence itself, challenging us to think deeply about the universe and our place within. And so the next time you look up and see the darkness between the stars, remember that darkness is not just the absence of light, it's a doorway to understanding the cosmos. Grain of millet paradox. If a single grain of millet falls, does it make a sound? What about a handful of grains or an entire sack? This simple yet profound question is at the heart of the grain of millet paradox, a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of perception scale and the nature of change. It forces us to confront a fascinating problem. How do tiny, seemingly insignificant action combine to create something noticeable or even monumental? The grain of millet paradox originates from the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno, who was famous for posing questions that defy intuition. The paradox is deceptively simple. A single grain of millet falling to the ground seems too small to make a sound. But if we multiply this action, a handful of grains or a sack full of them, they clearly produce a sound. So, when does the transition happen? At what point does something that appears silent become audible? The paradox forces us to think about how small incremental changes contribute to larger effects, and where we draw the line between something and nothing. To truly understand the grain of millet paradox, let's unpack its deeper implications. At first glance, the paradox seems like a question about sound and perception, but it's really about continuity and thresholds, how individual parts contribute to a whole. The grain itself represents a small, seemingly insignificant unit, and the sound it makes is so faint it's imperceptible, but when enough grains fall, they collectively create a noise that's undeniable. The paradox highlights the disconnect between individual units and the collective outcome they produce. This idea extends far beyond sound. Think about a pile of sand. If you add one grain at a time, it's hard to say when the collection of grains becomes a pile. Similarly, when you remove grains one by one, at what point does it stopped being a pile? The grain of millet paradox belongs to a family of puzzles known as soar paradoxes, which explore how small incremental changes lead to significant shifts. These paradoxes force us to confront the ambiguity of thresholds and challenge the precision of the categories we use to define the world. Philosophically, the grain of millet paradox raises questions about perception and experience. If a single grain falling doesn't make a sound we can hear, does that mean the sound doesn't exist? This touches on broader debates in epistemology, the study of knowledge and the role of human perception in defining reality. Are things real only when we perceive them, or do they exist independently of our senses? The paradox nudges us to consider whether small, imperceptible phenomena are just as real as those we can observe. The paradox also has a practical dimension, particularly in the context of cumulative effects. Think about climate change. One person driving a car or using plastic might seem insignificant, but when billions of people do the same, the impact becomes undeniable. The grain of Millet paradox reminds us that even the smallest actions can accumulate into something powerful. It's a call to think critically about how individual choices add up and to recognize the collective impact. Riddle. It's a riddle. It's a wands. The paradox even applies to personal growth and habits. Imagine trying to learn a new skill like playing the piano or learning a language. Practicing for a single day might not seem to make a difference. But practice consistently over weeks, months, or years, and the results are transformative. The grain of millet paradox teaches us the importance of persistence and patience, showing that small, consistent efforts can lead to profound change. But the paradox isn't just a lesson in accumulation, it's also a reminder of the limits of human perception. Our senses aren't perfect. They have thresholds below which we fail to notice things. A single grain of millet might make a sound, but it's too faint for us to hear. This raises intriguing questions about what else we might be missing. What phenomena too small, too slow, or too subtle exist beyond the range of our senses, shaping the world in ways we can't perceive? In modern science, this idea has fascinating parallels. In quantum mechanics, for example, particles behave in ways that are invisible to the naked eye, but have profound effects on the physical world. In biology, the behavior of a single cell might seem inconsequential, but together cells form tissues, organs, and entire organisms. The grain of millet paradox reminds us that the world operates on multiple scales, and what seems insignificant at one level can be transformative at another. The paradox also has ethical implications. In a world facing collective challenges like inequality, environmental degradation, and public health crisis, it's easy to feel that individual actions don't matter, but the grain of millet paradox reveals the power of accumulation. One act of kindness, one vote, or one effort to reduce waste might feel small, but multiplied by millions, these actions can change the world. The paradox challenges us to reconsider the significance of our choices and to recognize the ripple effects of even the smallest contributions. So what's the takeaway from the grain of millet paradox? First, it teaches us to pay attention to the small things, the grains of millet, the drops of water, the moments of effort that shape our world in profound ways. Second, it reminds us of the interconnectedness of individual actions and collective outcomes. And finally, it encourages us to embrace complexity, recognizing that change often happens not in giant leaps, but in the steady accumulation of tiny steps. The grain of millet paradox isn't just a philosophical puzzle. It's a powerful lens for understanding the world. It challenges us to think critically about perception thresholds and the cumulative power of small actions. And perhaps its greatest lesson is this: in a universe where even the faintest sound of falling grain can add to the symphony of existence, nothing is truly insignificant. Every grain matters, and so do you. Paradox of the Raven. If someone told you that looking at a green apple could prove that all ravens are black, you'd probably think they were joking, but that's exactly what the paradox of the Raven suggests. And it's one of the most mind-bending puzzles in logic and philosophy. How can something as unrelated as the color of an apple tell us anything about ravens? This paradox forces us to question not only how we think about evidence, but also how we understand the way knowledge works. The paradox of the Raven, also known as Hempel paradox, was introduced by the German philosopher Carl Gustav Hempel in the 1940s. It starts with a simple statement: all ravens are black. In logic, this is equivalent to saying if something is not black, then it is not a raven. These two statements mean the same thing. They're logically interchangeable. But here's where things get strange. If you want to prove that all ravens are black, you might think the best way to do that is to observe lots of black ravens. And that's true. Each black raven you see adds evidence to the claim, but by the same logic, observing something that is not black and is not a raven, like a green apple, also counts as evidence for the statement all ravens are black. Why? Because a green apple fits the idea that if something is not black, it's not a raven. So according to the rules of logic, spotting a green apple provides just as much evidence for the claim as spotting a black raven. This is the paradox of the Raven. It challenges our intuition by suggesting that evidence for a statement can come from observations that seem completely unrelated. At first, this idea feels absurd. How can looking at an apple tell us anything about ravens? The paradox arises because of the way logical equivalence works. If the statement all ravens are black is true, then So, is it contrapositive if something is not black, then it is not a raven? Any observation that fits the contrapositive, like a green apple, logically supports the original statement, but our intuition rebels against this. We feel that looking at a raven tells us more about ravens than looking at an apple. Does the paradox reveals a disconnect between formal logic and human intuition? In logic, all evidence that supports a statement is equally valid no matter how it's obtained, but in practice we assign different weights to different types of evidence. Seeing a black raven feels like strong evidence for the claim all ravens are black, while seeing a green apple feels irrelevant, even though both are logically equivalent. To make sense of this, let's dig deeper into the nature of evidence. When we evaluate evidence in the real world, we're not just thinking about logic equivalence, we're also considering how informative or specific the evidence is. A black raven is directly related to the claim, so it feels highly relevant. A green apple, on the other hand, doesn't seem to tell us much about ravens, even if it technically supports the statement. This highlights a key limitation of formal logic. While it provides a framework for reasoning, it doesn't always align with how we process information or assign significance to evidence.